All right, so welcome to what we'll call class 1B of straight stitches, where we're going to double back a little bit to composite straight stitches. So where the stitch is not just each individual one, but each stitch is going to take multiple parts. So let's start with a simple cross stitch. So one straight stitch, and then if you imagine the corners, or if you're on counted fabric, you don't have to imagine your corners, and you cross it. So straight stitches or cross stitches can be done individually, almost like seed stitch. They can also be done as part of another design. There's a brick and cross stitch, which just uses a pretty little cross stitch in it. The important part is that unless you are doing so intentionally, try to maintain the same order of up and down. Now, if I want my cross stitches to be attached like we would in cross stitch embroidery, then I need to sort of line them up. If ever you realize that you've done the wrong arm first, you can always go over it. So let's say I'm going to do the wrong arm first. Which sometimes you might need to do if your thread is in the wrong place. And then I realize, oh no, I did the cross that was supposed to be on top first. It's okay. I can sneak under it. So it'll look more or less the same. So our next straight stitch is herringbone. I always do herringbone better if I have lines to work from. So let's just pause for a moment while I draw some lines. All right, again, always do better when I have lines to work from. So I am going to be moving from up here. I've also given myself cross lines so that I don't have to think about where my crosses should be. And back. And I'm going to cross. Now here's where I have a choice of how close I want this to be. I want to open this out a little bit more. So, and back, so that these two lines will be more or less even with each other. Yes. Yes. So herringbone is much easier to do on a counted fabric, for me at least. You can also do kind of a wonky herringbone if you don't need it to be perfectly even. It's also really beautiful to couch a piece of ribbon down, or to make a channel so that a ribbon can go into. Makes a lovely edging. Works nicely if you add beads to decorate it as well. And it is a foundational stitch for interlaced stitches. So I've just used a water-based quilting pen here to help me mark my lines. That'll disappear with water. is my herringbone. Next up, laid trellis. This one eats thread, and again, I do better if I have a guideline, so let's give me a moment to mark my lines. All right, so I've marked myself the shape of my space. Ordinarily, I might outline this in a stitch, or I might be covering up a stitch, so we're not going to worry about that today. I'm going to move along the diagonals of my stitches, or of my lines. So I'm connecting these points, which I tried to draw more or less evenly. For stitches like this, it's very important to work under tension. You'll find it an awful lot easier if you're using a frame or a hoop. Now, here is where changing my direction is easier if I plan that out. Down we come. All right. So now I have all of these intersections, and I could leave it as is, but these long stitches are weak. So what we do then is come up beside the intersections. We could do this with the same color thread or with a different thread. I don't have another one threaded right now, so we're just going to... I usually give these a single stitch. Some people prefer to give them a little cross stitch. You could also add a bead right here to catch these down. And I prefer working in a zigzag motion because it's most efficient. Here is also where I could, if I'm paying attention, help to fuss with any inconsistencies in my lines to get them to lie a little bit more evenly. We're not too concerned about that today, so. And again, whether I'm working top to bottom, bottom to top, doesn't worry too much so long as I'm being relatively consistent. Oh, try not to split my thread. And because this stitch eats thread, I will have to keep pulling forward to reset my needle. And here, just for time's sake, I'm going to skip across because I have an uneven number here. Again, if you're concerned about how the back of your work looks, you'll want to be a little bit more consistent. Now here's where I'm going to do a little bit of a trick because I don't like where those are sitting. But I can pull them down so that they sit where I want them to. So there's a laid trellis stitch. I'm going to reset or give myself new fresh threads, and then we will move on to a crow stitch. Back with a fresh thread. So I'm going to make crow's foot, which is also a tailoring stitch. Basically, it's a little arrow, which you won't be able to see very well until my threads aren't in the way. So, if it's an individual stitch, then it's sometimes called a crow's foot. But if we put them together, we'll make a fern stitch. So the first one goes in the opposite direction, because you can't start where you left off. And I'm going to try to keep it relatively even. Oh dear. Okay. And back down. Let's just adjust my tension here. That's a little better. So, first stitch, further down my line, moving back towards where I was stitching before, and now out to the side and down, out to the side and down. One more of these. Out to the side and down, out to the side and down. And there's a fern stitch. Lastly, let's look at two different types of couching. So I have my thread to be couched. Let's just use this coral. And simple couching is not dissimilar from either a running stitch or a sort of series of straight stitches. I usually put them on their sides a little bit. I could couch in a straight line, or I can curve it around. This is sort of a composite stitch, but it's very simple and only straight stitching, so I like to leave it here. Excuse me. But if we don't want to do just simple couching, then we can do something that is called thorn stitch, which is longer crosses. A little tricky to get started. And whether you move in the direction of the up and down or down and up is not super important. So basically, this is couching with long cross stitches. I'm running out of space here. To make something that looks not unlike a fern stitch. And again, whether you prefer to work from the larger outside in, or as I am here, from the smaller side out, just try to be consistent. And let's do one more of those. I lied, I said this was the last one for today, but I almost forgot Satin Stitch. Assuming that I can keep my work in place. Okay. So with Satin Stitch, there are two different methods. The first, I'm going to draw myself a little shape. Okay. So, I've come up in the middle of my shape, which is good for what I would like to teach. A modern satin stitch will have you wrap the thread in one direction. I find that that's very wasteful and I don't prefer it. So, I like the older style of satin stitch from when threads were very expensive and you wouldn't want to waste half of them on the back. So for this, I'm moving up and down, and I'm moving over only a couple of threads on my ground material and keeping the shape of the piece. Now, ordinarily, you would outline your shape in a back stitch or a similar first, so that you get a nice crisp edge, and then you'd be moving just over the edge of it. You could also have a padded satin stitch, where you do your stitches in one direction first, and then in the opposite direction afterward, which I'm not going to do today. You'll notice that my lines are wandering a little bit, so I really have to keep an eye on that. Sometimes you'll find it handy to lay the thread where you want it to be. So a satin stitch like this is worked, there we go, with only a smallish area. If you want to cover a larger area with satin stitch, here's where we're going to move back, then you would want to cover it with something like the trellis, laid trellis that we did earlier, or there's a stitch called a bio stitch, where effectively you make a little trellis of couching stitches. There we go. This thread likes to fight me. I'm going back along in between my lines. There we go. If you ever get lost, just smooth out your lines. When doing things like satin stitch, it's very important to make sure that you don't end up with knots and snarls on the back. And also, this is where sometimes people will use something called a laying tool, which is usually just a piece of smooth edge, or almost something like an awl tip. Sometimes you'll see it as fitted for the end of a finger, so that they can smooth their threads into place. Do try not to stab your fingers on the back. So, you don't need to watch me finish this. And we're back. A little bit messy, so you can see where speed and not using a laying tool made it a little bit less tidy, but the satin stitch does have a nice gleam to it. So let's look at the back side of this. Oh dear. Limited space. So here we have the trellis, laid trellis, and these are all those little stitches that hold it in place. As well, we have the herringbone, which is basically like a back stitched on 2 lines. Some cross stitches here. Over here is the thorn stitch, which started out as a single crow's foot. Then we have the couching and the, fern stitch, thorn stitch, and then our satin stitch with the older style of using less thread on the back. So thank you very much.